What happens when the people no longer believe their own leaders? With a stroke of the pen, Vladimir Putin annexing Russian-held parts of Ukraine this Wednesday, even as those territories shrink in real time. As the casualties mount and amid the blowback against mobilization, what will this Russian president do if he keeps losing on the battlefield? How does a cornered, nuclear-armed strongman react? It's not just Putin. North Korea seems ready to think about the unthinkable. What with, for the first time in 5 years, Pyongyang conducting a ballistics missile test over the island of Japan into the Pacific. How volatile is this moment in time that we live in? As we approach the 60th anniversary of the Cold War's most nerve-wracking standoff, some argue there's even more uncertainty today than during the Cuban Missile Crisis. What does the Kremlin's current occupant mean when he warns the West that this is not a bluff? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if nuclear war is indeed no longer the unthinkable. Joining us, investigative reporter Anastasia Kirilenko, co-producer of the documentary Putin and the Mafia. Thanks for being with us. We also want to welcome back journalist Craig Kapitas, author of Bear Hunting with the Politburo. How are you, sir?
I'm doing fine, mon capitaine.
In his doctoral thesis chronicles the history of the arms race. Thomas Fraise is with the French Political Science Institute, Sciences Po's Nuclear Knowledges program. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Welcome for having me.
And from the Boston suburb of Cambridge, Massachusetts, Mariana Bujerin, Senior Research Associate with Harvard University's Project on Managing the Atom. Good to see you.
Nice to be back.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Yeah, ever since February, Vladimir Putin has been feeding us a steady diet of nuclear-sized threats. February, when he invaded Ukraine, as Yinke Oyatari reports, he's certainly got the arsenal.
First, Vladimir Putin gave this stark warning on September 21st.
We will, without question, use all the means at our disposal to protect Russia.
Then last Friday, he said this.
The United States are the only country in the world to use nuclear weapons twice. Actually, they set a precedent.
Both Kyiv and NATO say they are taking Russia's hints at the use of nuclear weapons as it pursues war in Ukraine very seriously.
Nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought, and it will have severe consequences for Russia.
It's words that have been echoed by Washington, who, according to national media, is considering responses to possible Russian escalation in Ukraine, including the use of tactical weapons. Russia has the most nuclear warheads of any country in the world. Experts put its stockpile at an estimated 5,977. Over a quarter of the weapons are deployed strategic warheads, which are powerful enough to obliterate entire cities thousands of miles from any battlefield. The threat facing Ukraine, though, is Russia's non-strategic or tactical weapons, which are smaller nuclear warheads intended for battlefield use to destroy targets in a specific area. All of Russia's tactical weapons are in storage, which analysts believe could hinder any potential nuclear action, because they'll have to be taken out of bunkers and matched with launchers. The weapons aren't battle-ready, but experts say this is intentional from Russia, who expect the US and other states to pick up on any sign of nuclear warheads being removed from storage, a move they apparently hope will scare the West and force them to dial back their support for Ukraine. In spite of the ominous signals from Moscow about escalating the war, Western officials still largely believe the nuclear threat remains relatively low, with any action sure to turn Putin into a global pariah, pushing Russia further into diplomatic and economic isolation.
Without going too much into the subtleties between tactical and strategic nukes, you could say that this is something that's lost on the Russian side, as Craig Kapitas interviewed for the Daily Beast. You quote him as saying, "A nuclear blast is a nuclear blast."
Full stop. Lots of people die. You can do the math, calculate the body counts, but at the end of the day, you set off a nuke, people are going to die, it's going to start a nuclear war, and there really is, the experts I spoke with, no difference between a tactical nuclear weapon and a strategic nuke.
Maria Bujerin, the way we've been reporting this story in the media, are you alarmed that we are kind of making this distinction?
I am very alarmed, but not exactly for the distinction between the strategic and tactical nuclear weapons. I certainly agree that the effects of any nuclear use would be catastrophic, but we need to understand the difference between strategic and tactical battlefield in order to know how these weapons can actually be used, what are their purposes and what are their tasks, as it were, within the Russian military doctrine, within their operational plans. The strategic arsenal is there primarily to deter NATO and the West. These are very long-range systems, and here we're talking not only about the yields of the warheads themselves, but about the delivery systems. Those are ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that are programmed, they're targeted to hit targets in the United States, for instance, not in Ukraine. The same with nuclear submarines, and the same with strategic aviation. That's why we do have to watch very carefully those non-strategic nuclear weapons that are allegedly non-deployed. That is, they're being stored in these warehouse facilities and have to be still taken out, transported to the units that could potentially use them, mated with delivery vehicles like short-range ballistic missiles or cruise missiles, and then we will know that Putin might be ready to stage a nuclear attack on Ukraine.
And do we know what the timeline would look like for a Russian president taking these weapons out of storage?
It would probably, we don't know for sure. We do know where those sites are, the storage sites. They're called Object S sites. Western intelligence agencies, I'm pretty sure, are watching them very, very closely, and any movement around them. I think there would be a warning of a couple of days at least.
Last week, Anastasia Kirilenko, we heard the Russian president saying this is not a bluff. What was your reaction then?
Yes, of course, we have to take it seriously. In the same time, I don't think it's unavoidable. Now, Russian propaganda started the victimization, saying we are losing against NATO. But well, they don't insist so much on nuclear weapons, at least as for today, because every day something new happens.
Because we've heard we've heard, for instance, the former president, Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev on his Telegram channel has been talking up using nuclear weapons in the past. You're saying that's being toned down now?
No, but the case of Medvedev is interesting because he was a liberal. Now he is so much afraid that somebody from the Putin circle, from FSB, will say, you know, Medvedev a traitor. That he tries to be,
as the French say, more royalist than the king.
Yes, exactly, more royalist than the king, the best friend of Putin, etc. For example, also Ramzan Kadyrov, Chechen so-called president, also said we have to deploy tactical nuclear weapons immediately, but it's not his responsibility. He's just a region leader, and he is being used by propaganda to scare people.
Used by propaganda to scare people. It is a volatile time. We are guessing what's going on. We have the latest element, which is we saw this signing, and I'll put it to you first, Mariana Bujerin. We saw this signing earlier today by Vladimir Putin, ratifying what had already been approved by the Duma, the taking over of these parts of eastern Ukraine. And then there was another signing specifying that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is Europe's largest, currently in Russian hands, is also part of Russia. Of course, that was a given, wasn't it?
Well, you know, it was de facto stolen from Ukraine over the course of the last 7 months, and, you know, disconnected from the Ukrainian grid and so forth. And now the latest development was that the director of the plant was kidnapped, harassed, and then released to the Ukrainian authorities and replaced by allegedly a Russian. So de facto, that was already the case. The worrying part of that development is, of course, that it seems that Russia would be at liberty to interpret a Ukrainian counteroffensive on the now sort of allegedly annexed territories as breach of its own territorial integrity. And referring back to Putin's September 21st speech and September 30th speech, his nuclear threats seem to cover exactly that kind of scenario. And let me just note that that goes well beyond the pale of what the Russian nuclear doctrine has been saying about the permissible use of nuclear weapons. It is not to, just in every case, defend Russia's territorial integrity. It's very specific and very conservative about the possible scenarios for nuclear use. So we really don't understand how much the Kremlin is willing to follow its own nuclear doctrine.
Oh. Thomas Frez, are you having a hard time reading what the Kremlin's doctrine is?
It's hard to read it because it is written in a way where you have some margin of maneuver. It's just the doctrine in a sense. It's not the text that will be followed word by word in case of a possible nuclear attack. So the way Vladimir Putin is using the document makes us think it's possible that in the context of the Ukrainian war, nuclear weapons could be used. But then quickly afterwards, and I think it happened on Monday, other officials will communicate the fact that no, it's only related to the territorial integrity of the Russian state and the possibility of the existential threat of the Russian state. So there's a permanent ambiguity about what is an existential threat to the Russian state. Is the Zaporizhzhia Oblast an existential threat? Is Crimea an existential threat? Obviously, the most obvious existential threat would be Moscow, but in this situation, Vladimir Putin is willingly playing on this ambiguity in the doctrine.
So playing on ambiguity.
Oh, there's nothing ambiguous about this, boys and girls. First of all, it's not Russian nuclear doctrine. What they're dealing with is Soviet nuclear doctrine. And let me tell you that Vladimir Putin is not Homo Sovieticus. He is not a commissar, he's a czar. He is very much willing to push a button on a nuke. You will ask why? Because he comes from this 19th century mindset where the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, and the Tsar came together as one. He is, to put it in Western terms, on a holy mission.
But we talk about mutually assured destruction. Is that not a nihilistic project?
Just like Jim Jones, he's a cultist. It does not enter into his wheelhouse about this. He is very capable because he doesn't have a 12-man Politburo like in the old days with Brezhnev. He can do what he wants. We've seen him doing this. Now, if he does it, God forbid he does it, the question, to be laser focused on this, what's the real question? It's not strategic versus tactical or any of this other stuff. We know for a fact that if he sets off any kind of blast, the West will respond in some way. Then the question becomes one thing. What will Putin and the Russian people do? Will they start screaming, Rodina, 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 we're under attack, and go full-scale nuke? Or will they take Putin out? Because there will be a response. And that is the issue, and I can guarantee you that's the issue that at the CIA and in the intelligence agencies are focusing in on a daily basis with laser-like specificity.
Anastasia Kirilenko, I want your response, but first, let's give one answer we heard from a retired general, David Petraeus, explicitly stating what the response could be to a Russian nuclear strike. The retired general speaking to ABC television on Sunday.
Just to give you a hypothetical, we would respond by leading a NATO, a collective effort, that would take out every Russian conventional force that we can see and identify on the battlefield in Ukraine and also in Crimea and every ship in the Black Sea Fleet.
Well,
It's pretty specific, isn't it?
I hope it will suffice. But unfortunately, first of all, Russian people stand behind Putin. We naturally, as media, we focus on the opposition, but Levada Center sociologists say at least 75% now support Putin. Even in the case of a possible nuclear strike, the propaganda will explain everything that, of course, it's the fault of the West.
Even despite the misgivings over mobilization, now that the war is kind of coming home to most Russians?
Yes, of course, but I know also many Russians who are for mobilization, and this is horrifying, because Putin explained already that Ukraine probably had also a nuclear dirty bomb. How do you call it? It was part of the Russian narrative why they invaded Ukraine. So this is dangerous. This is the reason why the West has to deter Putin, and the West should be united in this. We are now in France. I remember that in 2017, Mélenchon, one of the candidate to the presidency, said that, you know, if Russia invades Baltic states, we can't respond with nuclear weapons. And everybody agreed. It was a debate. Well, they changed topic, but I think at that time even Macron said, of course, yeah, we can't. And I'm sure that in the Kremlin, they listened to messages of that kind. Now, of course, the situation changed.
But hang on, it's a difference between how would the West respond to the invasion of a sovereign state, now that we've seen it come into practice, to how would the West respond to the use of nuclear weapons?
Yes, but for example, if this nuclear weapons is used on the Snake Island or desert area, or if it's used even somewhere in Ukraine, it won't be the same than if it's used in Paris.
Were you surprised, first of all, Craig Kapitas, on how specific David Petraeus? I know he's not speaking in the name of the Pentagon anymore. He's a retired.
No, I wasn't surprised. Look, if anyone who's hung around, covered the military, or spent hard time in Moscow or in the Soviet Union covering this stuff as a reporter, yeah, and it doesn't. And what happens? And please, you know, we fail to explore a lot of the nuance anymore. There's this academic side. God bless the academic side who looks at all these issues, and then there's what I call the practical side. And you're right, Stas. You're absolutely right. But it doesn't matter where Putin may or may not hit with a nuke. The point of the exercise at the intelligence agencies and in the military right now is if he does hit, the West will counterstrike not with nukes. And again, the concern, the specificity of the concern is what would Putin do at that point with the counterattack, and what would the Russian people do? That right now, for all our discussion here tonight, that's the big unknown.
Mariana Bujarin, do you have any further clarity on the matter?
I do. I want to circle back to something Craig said, and that is, I think we certainly have to have a good portion of nuance here, and to make sure we make distinction between the risk of nuclear war, which is an exchange between two nuclear armed adversaries such as Russia and NATO, and a nuclear use of a nuclear country against a non-nuclear country that's also not protected by extended nuclear deterrence of an ally. And this is exactly what we see unfolding in Ukraine. So the way I see it, I see nuclear deterrence sort of working to induce restraint. Of course, these are very tricky counterfactuals, right? But 7 months into the war is contained to the territory, the original territory of that one country, Ukraine, and to the original two belligerents. And, you know, NATO has not gotten involved directly. It has not instituted a no-fly zone. It was very careful in calculating any escalatory risks of any military and armament systems that it provides, and instituting restraints on Ukraine on how it might use it. It's very careful not to escalate the conflict in the way that it would get involved directly. That is the workings of a deterrence. probably, right?
escalating.
You do not want to escalate to a nuclear level. You don't want to risk to escalate to nuclear level. Russia can say all at once that it's already fighting a war with NATO on Ukrainian territory. It can threaten to hit, the arms supply or arms supply in Poland, but it doesn't. And that's, again, due to the fear of escalation to nuclear level. Now, Ukraine is not protected by that. It is not part of a nuclear armed alliance. And I think what we're finding out right now is that it is very difficult to threaten something credibly on behalf of Ukraine's partners and supporters in the West to prevent such a nuclear use in Ukraine. Yes, David Petraeus gave a scenario, but he specifically said that it was a hypothetical. We, hope the Western countries and the Tiger team that we know has been instituted in the White House.
He used the word would. He didn't use the word could when he talked about the response.
Yeah, and he said hypothetical. Let me give you a hypothetical scenario. So I'm sure there are options that are being discussed. And maybe there have been more specific options or consequences that were communicated directly to the Kremlin. We know that there have been these private exchanges, right? But what we heard in the public, in public discourse, was, catastrophic consequences. Don't for President Biden. And that is, again, very, very ambiguous.
Yeah, but what about Craig Capitas's point that right now there aren't the kind of checks and balances within the system in Russia the way you had under the Soviet Union?
I think that's a very, very valid point. This is a very personalistic regime. And, we really don't have a very good view into the Kremlin and how the decisions are made. It's my impression that actually a lot of people, the Russian foreign ministry, were surprised by the invasion. They did not know. The decision for the invasion itself was made within a very, very small group of people in the Kremlin. This war is extremely personal to Mr. Putin. So it's a very troubling scenario. But what I'd like to impress that whatever prevents Mr. Putin from using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, it will not be nuclear deterrence.
Thomas Fraise?
No, I agree. I agree, especially on the point about the very personalistic regime of the USSR. We know that the not the USSR, the Russian system of command and control is inherited from the USSR with a three buttons system. But we also know that it is possible, or at least we hypothesize, because we know very little, in fact, but it is possible for Putin to go without the two other people, especially in the case of a tactical strike, or at least according to the most, the experts in the domain, especially I think thinking about Pavel Podvig in Geneva. And I think we tend to be convinced that, yes, but someone at some point will disobey, and it's not going to happen. But nobody disobeyed when it was about to invade Ukraine or other things. So it is a very possibility. And I'm not sure nuclear deterrence will prevent Putin from striking Ukraine with nuclear weapons. And I'm not sure that US attempts at deterrence, and for example, David Petraeus' declaration, would particularly work either. I would perhaps be a little more nuanced, but about the Russian reaction, because most recently there's been polls showing that a very small number of Russians are actually interested in favor of the use of nuclear weapons. It's something about 4%. Of course, once the nuclear threshold has been crossed, we don't have any reference point. We don't know what's happening. So maybe this will... this, as you said, will turn out to be in favor of the...
What we do know is any counterstrike, conventional counterstrike by the West, Putin will use that to beat the propaganda over the Russian people's heads that they're under attack. Now, let us not forget here that Putin also has on his side the Orthodox Church, who Archbishop of the church, the patriarch, has endorsed a nuclear strike. He has called the people of Ukraine subhuman. Think about that for a moment, folks. Think about that. You have the head of a church saying to launch a nuke strike to kill, butcher, murder subhuman people.
I have a proposal how to deter
Yeah.
this kind of things. I would like just to quickly react to the point that the West is trying not to escalate the conflict, but it is escalating since 2014. So Putin should understand that his country will be really a pariah if he uses this nuclear weapon. And as you said about Orthodox Church only joined Putin discourse. But what is interesting, like 1 week ago, Russians thought that Joseph Borrell, High Representative of the EU, accused Russia of being fascist. And they were seriously offended. Even without aggressivity, they were justifying themselves, civil servants at different levels, that how is it possible? I think it was reference to Timothy Snyder, that Russia became fascist, calling people subhumans, etc. So maybe also use some psychological, philosophical war to combat Russian.
Powerful ally.
But this is also the war of ideas.
Well, you also have two. Russia also has two other allies here. I'm talking about peripheral outliers that I think are important. Number one of you were mentioning before the Zaporozhye plant, okay, the atomic plant. Now, what's interesting about that is the gormlessness of the United Nations in dealing with this situation, and I've gotten that from a lot of Ukrainian experts I've spoken with, and people who are experts in nuclear energy and this and that. That the UN has really done nothing about that. The second thing,
not done nothing about it. They've got managed to get observers into the plant.
They got observers looking at the plant. That place should be surrounded by United Nations peacekeepers. Come on. You're looking at a disaster there that if that place is hit, you're turning that portion of Ukraine into a netherworld. I'm sorry, I believe the UN has been completely feckless and gormless about this entire situation. To hell with
the UN can only step in if both sides agree.
Oh yeah, well then we'll let a nuclear disaster happen. But by God, we follow the diplomatic norms. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Step up to the line, but don't cross over it. The second thing you mentioned before is earlier in the show is what happened earlier today at the OPEC II meeting. Well, look at that. The Russians and OPEC are cutting back production. Well, that tells me that Russia still has a lot of clout at OPEC, and that was never factored into this. So if you're looking at this cold-heartedly, which I think one has to do, you're looking at OPEC is now an ally of Russia.
Is that how you see it from where you are, Mariana Bujarin, in the United States, where the White House reaction to that OPEC price cut has been to call it misguided?
Well, it certainly bolsters Russian position, and none of us really like the fact that Russia might have still a way to finance their war machine and things like that. But if there is a silver lining, that perhaps then Russia still feels, or Putin still feels, that there's other tools that he still has. There's recourse to other things like, the mobilization, the leverage through OPEC before he goes nuclear. So this is sort of the way I've been trying to spin this negative into a positive. But to what Craig said about the UN, I think it is a little bit unfair. IAEA has done as much as it could within the purview of its mandate, and its Director General Grossi has done as much as it could. What I think we're realizing is that our international institutions that have been set up in the wake of the last Great War, Great World War in 1945, and whatever has sort of developed after that, they're just not up to the par. They're not designed to deal with this situation. The veto power cripples the UN Security Council, especially when one of the permanent members of Security Council is the belligerent. is a rogue state. So, yes, the peacekeepers should be deployed and surround the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, but to authorize it, you need a vote of the Security Council, and that is gridlock. So you are left with the coalition of the willing or some sort of thing that would, again, make other parties belligerents in the conflict and would be treated as an escalation. So these are very difficult things to weigh.
And we're coming up now to an anniversary. 60 years ago this month, the whole world held its breath. The United States discovered that Fidel Castro's new communist regime was pointing Soviet nuclear missiles in its direction. President Kennedy's generals advocated an airstrike to destroy the missiles. They talked about a ground invasion. Instead, he opted for a naval blockade and an ultimatum to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. The Cuban Missile Crisis came to a head when a U.S. U-2 reconnaissance jet was shot down over Cuba. All the while, Kennedy's own brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, negotiated in secret with the Soviet ambassador to Washington. The day after, Khrushchev announced the withdrawal of those missiles. Thomas Fraise, is today more fraught than during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
It's hard to say, actually. I think we do not realize how dangerous the Cuban Missile Crisis was because we realized it perhaps 30 years after when archives opened and we learned about cases of what we call close call, or especially a Soviet submarine officer who was very close to using nuclear weapons because he felt that the war had started, that U.S. ships were attacking his submarine, etc.
And we think that globalization is something new, but at the time, there were those U.S. missiles pointed at the Soviet Union from Turkey, and that was also in the mix.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the nuclear threat structured the whole Cold War. There was U.S. missile in Turkey, there was U.S. missile in Germany, there was British missile in Great Britain. I mean, yes, the threat is comparable in terms of danger and volatility of the situation to the Cuban Missile Crisis, although it is a bit different, I would say. On the bright side, perhaps, that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, although we praise the caution with which head of state acted, for a while they had pretty much no idea what they were doing. And there was a real escalation by Kennedy.
No idea. It's
not that they had no idea, they were in a state of limited information. They didn't know from the beginning that tactical nuclear weapons were on Cuba. This is it's a big information when you're planning on attacking Cuba, which was actually one of the original plan that was presented to Kennedy with an interesting argumentation, which was basically, it's 1938 over again. You cannot appease. You must go all in, which is an argument we still hear today. So I think this situation where both head of states have a situation which goes out of the hand because Khrushchev had not anticipated that. It was something he had not anticipated at all, that he would go into a whole crisis. And what we've learned most recently is that Kennedy could also have reacted much more differently, but he somehow chose to escalate for very various reasons, including domestic, limited information, extra. Here we're in a situation where maybe heads of states are more cool, although we have no idea what is Putin's rationality, and everything ends up being, we're not in Putin's head. And clearly this is something that was not true during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
You're right, yet there's one gigantic, significant difference. Back in those days, there was a group of people known as the wise men, people like Kennan, Harriman, Chip Bolin. Those people don't exist anymore to deal with the back channels that existed.
But surely there are back channels today between Moscow and Washington.
Not to the same degree that there were in those back in those days. The core of remember, back in those days, okay, the Soviet Union was run by the Politburo, which, if my history is correct, was 12 people. It wasn't one person who made a decision; it was the 12. Now, without going into the history, that's how decisions were made. Now you have one person in charge who everyone there is afraid of, if we believe everything. So whatever back channeling went on in the old days to one of the 12, that's not there anymore. And I've heard this from U.S. government officials. Sure, you can call up the ambassador and have a chat, but they don't have the the heft, the oomph, in the old days, and the fact that we're bereft of the wise man crowd anymore, I think also adds to the problem.
I think Russia was very proud of back channels during Trump administration, but we don't really hear about back channels with Biden administration. I agree that now the situation is more dangerous. Of course, I was young when the Soviet Union collapsed, but Khrushchev, in comparison to Putin, he's a big Democrat. He combated, he struggled the cult of personality of Stalin, and now Putin says himself that he is nostalgic for Soviet Union, Stalin, etc. The Cold War has nearly became hot many times, and now it's the same reason.
Mariana Bujarin, you agree that today is more fraught than during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Because the jury's split here.
I agree that it is a more dangerous moment. I think Anastasia is correct that Putin is a far more dangerous person than Khrushchev. Not because Khrushchev was a benign figure. He was a very cruel man himself. He was implicated into in many cruel things that the Soviet regime did. But he did say that any fool can start a war. He did not want a war. The reason why nuclear missiles were deployed to Cuba was to prevent a war, to prevent the expected U.S. Invasion of Cuba, to defend an ally, right? When he understood that he could not prevent the conflict from escalating, that Americans really had a preponderance in that region, with the quarantine and whatnot. And he demurred, and he struck a deal and withdrew these missiles. The similarity here is that even though he did allegedly answer to the 12 members of the Politburo, if what we know about these proceedings of the Politburo is that there was no red teaming. There was no XCOM. There was nobody, discussing or debating these things with him. He made a proposal. It was, it was accepted without much dissension. And the kind of the flip side of it was when the Operation Anadir, the deployment of missiles to Cuba ended in basically Soviet failure. That also spelled the failure of Khrushchev as a leader, that contributed to his removal from the heads of as a head of the state. And I wonder whether that lesson is not being lost on Mr. Putin, for whom too this war is very personal. On the back channels, I think it is not only the state of relations between the United States and Russia, but also the contemporary world. I mean, Bobby Kennedy, the Attorney General and the brother of the President Kennedy, was meeting with GRU, the military intelligence resident officer in Washington, Georgy Balshakov, right? Was his name. It is inconceivable today, when everything is so much in the public eye, for those kinds of meetings to take place secretly and for any kind of backroom deals to be struck. So I think politics is a lot more in the public eye today, and therefore these kind of deals are a lot more difficult to come by.
So I'm a little bit chilled by this conversation here, Thomas Fraise, because we all know the narrative about Putin, who looks at Gorbachev opening up the system, and that leads to the 90s and the disarray or the disorder in Russia. That's a lesson. Is it also a lesson? Khrushchev, who bends on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and 2 years later is out of a job with Leonid Brezhnev taking his place.
Well, I mean, I don't think Putin is taking as a lesson from peer review. If it's the lesson he draws from this is the lesson we have to keep in mind. So it says, it's a real possibility that he sees it that way, that you do not bend in front of the adversary. And we took the same lesson from 1938. You don't appease.
So hang on, let's get back to today then. You don't appease, you don't bend. Right now he's losing on the battlefield.
Yeah.
But the propaganda can explain everything.
Exactly. I mean, he can also I mean, he has said, you were mentioning before the fact that if the US strikes Russian ships in the Black Sea, he will say, see, we're attacked, but he's already saying that. So he has a margin of maneuver regarding propaganda that he can use to say, well, actually, we won. You see, there's no Nazi in Ukraine anymore.
You're right, but you know, I just a little aside here. The most important word in the Russian language for me is the word konkretna, which means concrete. Once the U.S. or the West hits a Russian target in response to a nuke strike, he can say whatever it is. He can say, look, we have concrete evidence. They use that word that goes back to old ancient Russian times. They use that word. It's a very important word. And unless I've missed it, maybe Mariana, she probably listens closer than I do, but I haven't heard him use that phrase konkretna, concrete. And once you use that in Russia, I've noticed from my years there, people, their ears perk up, the Russians, and they listen a little more intently.
Well, here's something that, I don't know, should it make us perk up, Anastasia Kirilenko? We're 2 days shy of Vladimir Putin's 70th birthday. Is that an important milestone or not?
Ukrainians are preparing a birthday gift. They said exactly. Well, Putin is at war with the reality, so we should not even waste our time to discuss a possibility that there's one bloc against another. He's at war with the reality. He spoke about evil. Yesterday, they said on Russian TV, homosexual kindergartens are being opened in Germany, and it's every day like this. So propaganda started to explain that.
Yeah, but isn't that scary? Because right now we're at a moment where it's as the old fable says, there'll be a moment where the emperor has no clothes if he keeps losing ground in Ukraine, and he has.
Yeah, from one point
How
of view,
can propaganda explain that away?
From the one hand, of course, it's scary. They seem to be at war even more than during the Soviet era. But from another point of view, Putin, anyway, he understands that. Well, he has to present a victory, not to really win. So during the first,
He can declare victory even if he loses. Is that what you're saying?
Of course, he wanted to invade Kiev. He lost. Then he explained that everything is under control. Now also everything is under control. He signed, the laws on the annexation. It's on paper.
There's even a Russian word for that, for what you just described, called pokazuka.
Yes.
That's exactly what it is.
Which means?
To pretend something.
To say something that's basic, say something that's real, that's not real, but everyone's going to buy into it. And again, this goes back to Kirill and the Orthodox Church and Putin controlling the airwaves and the propaganda machine and beating this into them and playing on the concepts of Russian nationalism and whatever. And what I firmly believe is that Putin is a Jim Jones kind of character. He's more cultist than czar. So he has the capability to press that button. God forbid he doesn't.
Jim Jones, just to remind our viewers, Mariana Bujarin, was a cult leader who basically organized a collective suicide of his cult in Guyana. Is Vladimir Putin nihilistic?
There's a whole cottage industry that's sprung up and trying to read Putin's mind and what kind of person he is. It is really difficult to say. We can't penetrate. Oftentimes, we don't know our own motivations. What we can see is that he is willing to take incredible risks that will hurt his own country and his own people. I mean, Russia will never emerge out of this the same. Yeah. It is ravaging Ukraine today, but long term, what he had started is suicidal for Russia and the Russian people. And he is doubling down. I mean, for me, just to observe this going on, and also the protests in Iran that were covered by the channel just before we came on air, this is this malicious, hubristic masculinity that we're up against. What is the psychology of that? I think this is what we have to think when somebody's ego is so deeply hurt, and when they think nothing of inflicting incredible hurt even on their own people. What are these people capable of?
All right, and something that we'll be talking about both when it comes to Russia and Iran. Mariana Bujarin, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. I want to thank as well Thomas Fraise, Anastasia Kirilenko, Craig Kapitas. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.